please help me welcome Dr. Mark Wolff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be able to share the work that I do at SAS with audiences. And I'm also always humbled by that opportunity because I always fear that they will want a refund of their 45 minutes in their life back. So I'm going to do best not to refund your time. Having said that, what I do want to do are three things. And I base this on my perception of who's on stage if I were in the audience. The first thing I want to do is I do want to educate you about something so you can learn maybe one small nugget, maybe more. I want that education, hopefully, to be appropriate and applicable to some of the questions and some of the problems that you're working on. And ultimately, what I hope is that education focused on something of interest to you. As you leave here, you can do something about those problems with that education. That is my hope. I'm not sure if I'll be successful, but I'll do my best. So I warn you, there'll be a little bit of pedagogy, pedantry, and I don't know what the third P is, but we'll move forward. So what is a quantum patient? And besides plugging my book, that's a term I think is quite appropriate to what we're talking about here today. This idea that the patient at the center of a healthcare universe can exist in different modalities as a function of different data, and those data can describe that patient appropriately, whether a provider, whether a payer, whether a researcher, and more importantly, and not to get into a lecture on quantum mechanics or physics, that patient exists in states of probabilities. And hopefully as we go through some of the work that I'm going to show you and some of the examples, you'll see how that aligns with that concept. So let me begin here then. If we're talking about a great deal of data, here's a quote from probably the greatest analyst that never lived. And I think it is really appropriate to what we're talking about here. We are all remarkably distinct and unique individuals. And at some point in time, we will have enough data about our own individual state that we will be able to practice a very amazing brand of personalized medicine. But having said that, before we get to that point, we will actually have to analyze ourselves en masse. And indeed, as those numbers grow, the certainty of what we understand grows. But that certainty can be then projected upon the individual. And it's remarkable that this quote was also given in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories to, of course, Dr. Watson, so the context there is absolutely perfect. Now, one brief word about the company that I work for and in terms of our view of the landscape and of the world with respect to healthcare. We believe, like many do, that there is a convergence occurring. And at the center of that convergence is indeed the patient. And that patient, again, I'm going to beat this quantum metaphor to death here, taking that patient in the middle, there are electron clouds of data circling that patient, if you will, research, data from payers, from providers, and so on. So we genuinely believe that from an analytics perspective, taking advantage of those data, using the patient as the focal point, we can address issues of outcomes, quality, and value. And that is indeed what I hope to talk to you about today. So briefly, I think we can all accept and understand the challenges that exist within the healthcare system broadly, and I would even add within, if we go beyond that into the research and to the scientific realms. And I'm not going to belabor these points, but one of the ones that I've actually been focused on, as mentioned earlier, is a uniquely valuable but uniquely challenging opportunity, and that is in unstructured data. Narrative, text, clinical notes. We're finding more and more that those data are remarkably important and valuable broadly in pursuing, as I said before, quality outcomes and value. Now, data. We talk, I don't particularly care for the term big data. I was actually at a conference recently, and it was about massive data. and massive data to uncover clinical insights. So is there anything beyond massive? I mean, at some point, I think we'll just get back to saying data. And size is always contextual, right? I'm sure hundreds of years ago, a tiny bit of data was massive. But anyway, here's a picture that represents big data. One of the challenges with big data is we lose where the patient is. There it is, right there, that little tiny baby. And all those machines and all the individuals that interact there, they're all generating data. And then there's data outside of that room. And then there's data in the laboratories and in the universities. It is a massive, massive data problem. And often, those data are unstructured. So, again, going back to my metaphor, this is a wonderful quote from a gentleman by the name of Christian Lovis. He's a physician in Geneva who runs a program called Debug It. And he's a physician and an IT individual. And his challenge in his program Debug It, as you may maybe anticipate, is to monitor antibiotic resistance, and in monitoring that resistance, give feedback to clinicians and hospitals in the best use of certain antibiotics to manage resistance. And in a presentation he gave not too long ago, he beautifully described the data challenges of healthcare. We are a probabilistic science. And again, remember that metaphor I'm going to beat. It's going to be quite dead by the time I'm done. We will always have data quality and completeness issues. We will always have to be able to describe outliers and unexpected events. That is the very nature of biology. And indeed, often the outlier is precisely what you're looking for. So standard sort of quality control metrics are not always appropriate because we want to understand the outlier and we want to have confidence that it is indeed interesting. And those data will come in many, many dimensions. And the temporal dimension often will be the most complex computationally. And dealing with that, I like to say data existing in probabilistic n-dimensional space moving through time. That's a tough problem, but we're working on it. So I say deal with it, don't ignore it, and don't oversimplify it either. Now, since I think I have a slide later that talks about this, but since the paper published in 1959 in Science magazine talking about the rationale for computational clinical diagnostics, we've been talking about how computers will help us deliver high-quality care at value, but we're still talking about it. What has changed now that I'm here speaking to you about the same thing that was addressed in the late 50s? Well, I would argue that our analytic capabilities have matured. They have significantly matured in terms of what we can do and how fast we can do it. Certainly, the amount of data available, digitized data, today is immense compared to just 5 years ago. And those data now are being formalized, standardized, anonymized, and available for study. And finally, there are dramatic changes, social, legal, economic, that are driving the initiative to apply analytics to healthcare. And it's not just in this country. I'm fortunate to be able to speak about these topics across the world, and I've been to some of the best, what one would consider some of the best healthcare systems in the world, with the best registries and the best biobanks and life-to-death data, absolutely clean and ready for analysis. Why in the world would we still be having that discussion about analytics and data if it seems on the surface they've figured it out? They haven't. Access to care, delivery of that care, sustaining the quality of that care against chronic diseases, against aging populations, is a profound challenge, even in systems that have solved a lot of the problems we are now working on in the US. So, a bit of pedantry, please. What is analytics? I will only spend a few minutes on this, and forgive me if you think, why is this fellow describing analytics to me? As a college student, I was handed this very book in one of my science classes. And it didn't occur to me what that book meant until decades later. After working 10 years at SAS, after thinking about analytics all these years, it finally hit me. What is analytics? One simple thing: data reduction. Everything else is a technique. It's a technique to reduce data to the absolute minimum set of information to make a decision. And the second bit there, the error analysis part, how confident am I that that reduced data set has anything to do with the question I'm asking? That's it. Everything else is a technique. T-tests, averages. What's an average? It's a data reduction step. What's a t-test? How sure am I that those two columns have anything to do with what I'm asking about? So if you really think about it, it's not any of that fancy mathematical, statistical stuff. It's none of that. It's the simple process of data reduction. It's taking that picture of that hospital room and throwing away stuff until you actually see the baby and you actually see the gizmo that's helping you answer the question you're looking for. That's analytics. Now, something else about analytics. How come in 1977, a very famous statistician, by the way, many I'm sure of you are quite familiar with, published a book and essentially tried to tell us that visualization is an amazing form of analysis. In fact, it may be one of the best forms of data reduction for massive amounts of data. That was 1977. Why have we not been, broadly speaking now, using visualization as a primary form of analytic technique? Because visualization is not simply confirmatory, it is profoundly and specifically exploratory. And often we're interested in doing data exploration visually to do the appropriate amount of reduction. And now that computational power makes sampling irrelevant, why sample? Did you ever ask yourself that question? Who needs a sample? We can put it all into memory, all into Hadoop, put it all on a screen, and look at every single data point. And with our domain expertise, rationalize whether an outlier is or is not important. So I would say, think about my definition of analytics. Think about Tukey's explanation of the value, the rigorous value of visualization, and put those two together with big data, and there you go. You've got a 3-step program for solving a lot of your problems. Now, it's more than 3 steps. It's really a few steps. So very briefly, this is, and I will actually show you how this works in practice in a moment on a project I worked on. This is really a recipe. So if you went into your kitchen and you wanted to make a dish, and that dish actually was some analytic process by which you want to answer a question, I often talk to people about, well, how do you begin? And the challenge is putting the cart in front of the horse. Don't start with some fancy analysis, some models, some really complex stuff. If a simple rule answers the question, that's good enough and move on. If a rule doesn't answer the question, see where the anomalies occurred. If an anomaly doesn't answer the question, look at what happened in the past, which has been modeled, and see whether anything today fits the past. You may or may not answer your question. And this is the reason why I'm showing you this sort of recipe for creating these analytic dishes. What if I still don't have any insight into the question? Well, often what we find is that that insight can be trapped in data that you don't have access to because it's in some unstructured format, maybe a strange spreadsheet, a PDF. It's a narrative or clinical notes. It's a description. At that point, begin the process over again, but now enrich the data by extracting information from the unstructured information. And if you still don't know the answer, then go to that whole n-dimensional space network analytics, associative linking, and temporal mapping. That's what we do with really, really complex problems, for example, like money laundering and insurance fraud. And many types of fraud are so complex that we get to that last bit. But all the other ones are important as well. So enough education. Let's get into some of the examples. Larry Page, actually, that's a quote from about a year ago. He said, "Wouldn't it be great if we could share our data? Think how many lives we would save." And as you know, in a minute, there's a program that Google just started, and the first data are back from that program, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, Larry's a little late to the game. There are a lot of data sharing examples. I list these three because I'm involved with them personally. Project DataSphere. Dr. Goodnight, our CEO and founder, has many philanthropic interests. One of them is improving cancer care and cancer research. And he was part of what's called the CEO Roundtable on Cancer. And we've set up an organization and the infrastructure at SAS in Cary, North Carolina to host DataSphere, where all the companies involved in producing drugs for cancer donate their clinical trial data to this one centralized repository, and we make those data available for researchers to speed up and improve cancer care. Well, that was a pretty good idea. So the European Medicines Agency recently provided guidance to the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry. You need to do this. So now, by regulatory fiat, companies all around the world that produce medical products in Europe, because that's where EMEA's jurisdiction is, are building systems and putting their data in there and allowing access to all that data that previously was trapped in their archives to researchers and scientists to speed up healthcare discovery and healthcare to study how outcomes relate to putative drugs that were tested in clinical trials that may have failed. Looking at trials that have failed is also important. And finally, the work I'm doing with the US FDA around social media, patient preference, and improving outcomes and safety in healthcare. So I'll talk to that in a moment. I don't know if you saw this, the baseline study that Google proposed. They've just completed or recently completed the first 200-person workup. You can see 3.75 terabytes of data per 200 people there across those domains. The expectation here is that people will volunteer, again, voluntary, their personal healthcare data, volunteer their gene sequences, everything about them, and Google will keep building and building and building a quantum patient, a mathematical description of what a healthy individual looks like. So very interesting program in terms of data. Now, two quick things. What can we do with all this? And I think there are two challenges and two opportunities. One is around the area of translational medicine. How can we take these data, how can we take these insights and not just publish a paper, but actually move towards delivering some tangible asset, drug, some technique, some insight to improve people's lives, to improve the outcomes, increase the safety of those procedures, and at the same time, manage the cost and maximize value. That will be a challenge, but I think we need to focus those data on this, and we also need to focus those data on behavior. Sometimes we forget about that. Sometimes we forget that the best medicine is useless if the behavior isn't there to comply, if the behavior isn't there to take advantage of it. And as the gentleman said this morning, it's not just about not getting up and moving or not taking your medicine. It's much more complicated than that. And he referred to customer intelligence or behavioral intelligence around the retail industry. That's an excellent example of how the behavior of our customers understood and, frankly, manipulated. Manipulated to get them to buy what the retailer wants them to buy. We should be able, perhaps it's a pejorative term, but we should be able to understand patient behavior and manipulate it to their own benefit. That is a bad word, isn't it? I'll think of a new word next time. Okay, two quick case studies. And how am I doing on time? Good, okay. I want to talk about the work we've done on patient-reported outcomes and discrete event simulation. So I'm going to take almost the extremes analytically. On one end, we're going to talk about how people discuss their health online and what the government and the FDA is doing to take advantage of those discussions to improve what they do, which is monitor the safety and the efficacy of drugs, devices, and food, for example. And on the other end, how a hospital is using sophisticated mathematical analysis to model and simulate units within the hospital to improve outcomes and reduce costs. So at one end, a very formal care delivery setting. On the other, the most informal thing you can think of, just people talking about their health online. So let's see how analytics, and let's see how we achieve those goals in terms of understanding those problems. So let's start with the patient-reported outcome measures. There is an incredible interest in understanding what people say online about their health. It's from pharma, it's from government, it's from insurers, it's from researchers, it's across the board. And that interest about how people talk about themselves is not just in formal or clinically reported outcome measures, but in these, what I call unsolicited, self-reported patient outcome measures. Now, the FDA thought about this, and I have to give them credit because I didn't go to them. They actually solicited in bizops.gov, where solicitations are made for services. The FDA said, we would like in-house capability to monitor social media. And we want to do it for two specific reasons. One, what do patients think about the products we regulate? And two, can we extract safety-related information from those data? It is well understood that most of the safety-related data associated with drugs and devices is available on the web in informal discussions, not in the formal safety databases that the FDA or other organizations manage and take care of. And indeed, in Europe, there's an organization being set up just to do that, an industry-government relationship called WebRadar. Now, the FDA has an interest in this because they believe that this information may also be more timely. They do surveys, they do analysis, but it can be too time-consuming, costly, and sometimes the results occur after the fact. So this is a dramatic change, and it just happened earlier this year. And I'm pleased to say that the work that I'm going to share with you was very successful and supported this initiative called the Patient Preference Initiative. I was fortunate enough to be on some panels and some workshops at the FDA to help them understand how best to monitor social media for the purposes that they were interested in. And all of that work resulted in the first ever approval of a product by the FDA where the patient's preference of that device was considered as an important factor in the regulatory decision. That's never happened before. Devices were either safe and effective or not. Now we have safe, effective, and do the patients who would benefit from this want this treatment device or drug? And, remarkably, are they willing to accept an excess level of risk or morbidity? That's remarkable. That's never happened before. And it puts the patient now even more at that center, even when it comes to the regulators. They're even asking, well, what does the patient community think? Should we approve this or should we not? So, a patient-reported outcome, it's just something somebody says that wasn't interpreted related to their health. And that's a globally understood definition. What did we do then for the FDA? Well, we took the whole internet and created some SAS tables. And once we had that, we visualized them into a report and handed it to the director. It literally was just like that. Now, in between, there are some bits that I'm going to explain. Social media, where do you start? We started with Twitter. Run away. There's nothing useful on Twitter when it comes to health, safety, when it comes to a patient's understanding of their health and drugs and devices, nothing. It's a sea of marketing, salesmanship, propaganda, and banality. I don't care that you went to the grocery store. I don't. Now, you may think that's just me. No. There's a wonderful study here that says Twitter is really a propaganda platform for things that are really important. And the loudest voice, or the most busy bot is the winner. Well, what about safety? Well, there's an article published in Drug Safety, peer-reviewed journal, very good journal, one I read actually. They studied Twitter to understand what patients are reporting about side effects. I'm surprised this paper got published because the conclusions were the data are very noisy and irrelevant, and we can't believe anything we found. Wow, put that on your resume. Really? Why didn't you call me? I knew that. We did the study. We just didn't publish it because we didn't publish negative results. So what did we do? Well, after a lot of research, we found that the best place to look are on forums. Forums dedicated and related to communities associated with a device. Believe it or not, there are forums related just to one medical device, to a disease, epilepsy, depression, obesity. Forums generally dedicated to certain therapies. And it is remarkable what people share, how detailed it is, and how, frankly, remarkable free of noise it is. Not completely, and I'll talk to that in a minute. But the FDA didn't just want that. They wanted context. So we also did an exhaustive analysis for the products of interest against their internal safety data. It's called the MAUDE database. We were working with something called the vagal nerve stimulator, a very controversial and potentially dangerous device. And the reason we are doing that is because the device they approved recently is a neural stimulator, which I'll talk to in a moment. So here we were looking at depression, epilepsy. We were looking at other related diseases that this device might be useful for. We looked at the internal safety data, and we looked at all the available scientific data. Now, most safety case reports associated with devices are narrative. There's very little structured data. So this project was almost exclusively text analytics, crawling the web and identifying units of text where a particular discussion was occurring around a particular product, pulling that in, and then analyzing those data against standard, for example, what is and isn't on the label as a side effect. That's a simple analysis of whether what these people are talking about is or is not of interest. The drug Avandia and the cardiac issues that that drug produced, particularly in patients with long QT syndrome, that was being discussed in clinical in patient-focused forums, particularly around diabetes and heart disease, a year or more before any of that information was known clinically to be relevant, meaning that Avandia was interacting with patients with long QT and causing heart attacks and deaths. That was, and a retrospective study of Avandia showed that exactly when there was a spike in those discussions in social media. So there's evidence actually that this is an appropriate method of analysis. The challenge is, how do you believe what you read? Remember that recipe I showed you? Well, we actually applied that as a method to build a lie detector for the internet. And I would say, not tongue-in-cheek, that we built a lie detector for the internet. And based on this approach and these techniques, in looking at each of the comments that individuals made, we produced these three, we're writing these three patent applications. Now, they're very wordy. They sound very, very sophisticated, I guess. Even some of the words, I don't know what they mean. But the thing is that using those analytic methods on massive amounts of unstructured data and finding those patterns, remember the quote from Sherlock Holmes, everybody's unique when they post online, but when you get enough posts, my goodness are there patterns, and my goodness is it repeatable and reproducible. So the first one is a mathematical component of the lie detector. We don't even want to know what they're talking about. All we want to know are frequencies of what they say when they say it, meaning groups of words together, irrespective of meaning, just very fancy frequency analysis. The second is a linguistic analysis, meaning what did they actually say and how did they say it? Things like biological plausibility, for example. And the third is something we came to discover and learn, which was rather obvious. People don't talk like physicians. They don't talk about their health in a MEDRA or a mesh kind of taxonomy. They say they have a headache. And the third bit says, can we extrapolate from the comment and the way people talk about headaches to find out when they're talking about a migraine, when they never use the word migraine, or when they talk about a concussion, when they've never used the word concussion. So what we discovered is there's an element of signal-to-noise filtering based on math, linguistics, and then disambiguation through context of what kind of headache, for example. Then we took all that information and we thought, hold on, this would be kind of interesting if we could sort of cluster all these people and look for who is talking about which side effect along with any other side effect, so the co-occurrence of side effect terms in their comment. And what was remarkable was that the vast majority of people would say something and move on, but there's this small slice of people who say very important things and they mention very important side effects together. And at that point, we wanted to clinically rationalize whether these were new syndromes, whether these were new safety issues, sort of like the Avandia example. And then we thought, but a retrospective analysis is interesting, but what we really want to do is, as we're monitoring these comments, predict when a certain frequency of coincidence of terms is indicative of a problem. So then what we did was we put all those clustering analyses and put into a movie. And if you could hit play there, what you see are thousands of comments, tens of thousands of comments, the side effects that we identified on the top, and then we did essentially a cross-correlation matrix and moved it through time. And each of those little red hotspots, that's a series of terms co-occurring at a point in time. And we can measure their trajectory and their momentum to find out when they were coalescing into a hotspot of terms, rationalize those terms clinically as relevant to an issue we want to study, and then say, as we're monitoring the web, when these terms occur at this frequency together, that's a warning. That's an indication that a problem is developing. And in fact, Facebook, and this is all public data, Facebook behind their firewall has instituted a similar kind of approach for suicide prevention. And they are monitoring posts on Facebook for certain key terms, and when those terms co-occur, they actually send a message or intervene in that user's on the assumption that there may be a threat of suicide. So this is actually, these types of analyses are being put into practice. These are public data, of course, Facebook's behind. This is actually quite neat stuff. This has been also done in clinical assessment. So for example, looking at large amounts of electronic health records and identifying clinical parameters that define the severity of a disease state, and then moving those parameters through time in a cross-correlation matrix to show what clinical indicators of, let's say, congestive heart failure occur at what point together, and then what happens after that. And actually using very simple math here to create these predictive measures of when these parameters are in these proportions at this point in time, that signifies either a positive or a negative outcome within some period of time. And that's really what we were modeling that work after. And then we did some really fancy stuff. And for example, you can see the red and the green is we would separate useful and non-useful information from people on the web. So there's a lot of math that can work here, and it's actually quite clever. But let me move on to the actual device. So because the device had not been approved yet, we had to do surrogates. So we were looking for other implantable neurostimulators as surrogates, and this device was approved for obesity and epilepsy, as you see here. And so we would actually investigate in social media those specific parameters, and those parameters then would be filtered through our lie detector, and then frequencies would be presented in a series of graphs, which I'll show you. Here's the evidence of the first ever event occurring where a product was approved by the US Food and Drug Administration using patient preference as a key component of that decision-making process. The survey analysis supporting that work was published recently. You can see here it's on the right, and then the product itself, you can see it's an implantable neurostimulator. This last week was presented at the FDA at a conference. These are the results of our work. This was a poster where SAS and FDA co-authored the social media analysis of these surrogate products for supporting this decision of how patient preference influences their regulatory work. Okay, now on to the other extreme. And this is a remarkable project, and it now needs some pretty serious math here. Working with Duke Hospital, SAS created a discrete event simulation of a neonatal intensive care unit. We literally simulated everything that went on in that unit in silico, using massive amounts of historical data of that unit's performance, resources, the various objective functions, the ins and outs of the units. And then the objective here was to optimize cost and quality, period. We wanted to know how cost relates for each patient to the quality of the outcomes. Now, there's only two ways to enter the unit, transfer or live birth, and there's only 3 ways to exit, transfer, death, and discharge. So it's a constrained system, and within that system, we have a very defined workflow, and we have very defined parameters around the resources. So get data for all of that, for 2 years' worth of behavior in that unit. Model those data in not just minima, maxima, and binary gates, but probabilistic models that interact and create these consensus probabilities. Well, if the probability of this is that, and you mix it with this and that, what is then the resultant probability of an outcome? Very sophisticated stuff, but actually real in the way real life works. There are very few absolute decisions that are made in units like these. These are, again, like Dr. Love has said, these are probabilities. If you can describe those probabilities in silico and allow them to interact, you get much more robust outcomes. This is where we built them. This is what it looks like. You know, I can talk about discrete event simulation and probabilities and gates and objective functions. That's it. Every one of those nodes represents a decision point or a point of inflection or a gate for a minimum and a maximum behavior. Minimum, exit, life or death, and entrance, gestational age, right? Those are discrete. Once you get inside, dramatic changes occur as a result of the interaction of the staff with the patient, with the drugs, and the therapies, and so on and so forth. We used historical data to build these models, to build this simulation. After all the math was done, we tested the simulation, and that is a remarkable outcome here. Look how close. Look at the fidelity between the real world and what the model does. We then use that to arrive at an answer for the question. And the question was simple. Does a shorter length of stay save money and improve outcomes? No. If you keep the baby for 3 more days, you get better outcomes and you save a lot of money. So the physicians went to the administrators and said, we can save money and improve outcomes in our unit by, in certain cases, keeping children at least 3 days longer. It was a counterintuitive result. But it was validated and, in effect, proven that indeed that simulation represented real life, and that simulation was able to provide us a best and worst case scenario, and that scenario could be aligned with value, cost, and outcomes. So, I mentioned that paper in 1959, Reasoning Foundations of Medical Diagnosis. 1959, we're still struggling with that. And then every few years, there's a prediction. 1962, digital electronic computers will assume an increasingly important role in medicine. I was born in 1962. I'm still waiting for digital computers to assume a more important role in medicine. And then in 87, another prediction. Since the earliest days of computers, healthcare professionals have anticipated the day when machines would assist in diagnosis. The Terminator, I guess. But as recently as 2013, a publication that in many, many parts of the world, machines are already starting to do primary care. And that was a wonderful article in the Atlantic not too long ago. So with that, I'm going to leave you with my last slide, which is a remarkable comment from an oncology conference in Europe recently. And the complexity of cancer, the complexity of the treatment of cancer, led these researchers to conclude that it is unethical for human beings alone to make treatment decisions in cancer. That's a remarkable statement. And I think statements like that, as evidenced through research, will show that our data and our machines are necessary because the information that is available to us to improve the health care of people is beyond human capacity to manage. And so I say, these quantum patients that we have, the simulations we make, the voice of the patient broadly in social media, these will all be important components in understanding that patient. But ultimately, we will have to use machines to help us process that information and do data reduction to get to what really hurts. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm not going to give any refunds for your 45 minutes, so I already decided I can't afford that. But thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Did I lose the clicker?
We do have time for 2 quick questions. Any questions? Anyone? A couple in the back. Let's get the mic over to him.
Hi, I was just curious if the data showed why the 3 extra days mattered.
Yes. So in the simulation, you can identify the points that actually change the trajectory of that simulation, and therefore understand whether it was a particular treatment, whether it was at a particular gestational age. So yes, you could understand what the causality was with the change in either cost or length of stay. Yeah, it would be pretty much worthless as a black box, wouldn't it?
Rob Jackson from SEMHE. I'm a family doc, and I just see a lot of small data that could be useful to be analyzed. For example, if you can predict when a patient is going to need dialysis because they have some chronic renal failure, you can save $50,000 because that's a hospitalization. So we can do that. It's very easy to figure out when they're going to need dialysis, and then you can get ahead of that and so on. Why aren't we doing simple things like that? Indeed.
There's a project at SAS that I'm involved with. We're very fortunate to have some very fine oncology centers at Duke and UNC in the area. And our objective was simple, to your point. We just wanted to create a patient registry of cancer patients that could be sorted. That's it. That's all we wanted to do. We didn't want to put any analytics in there, no modeling. And why would we want to do that? Well, if you've got thousands and thousands of small data sets that have come into the clinic over the years, and they've come for any number of tumors and any number of cancers, and they've been treated with any number of combinations of drugs and mechanical therapy, surgery, radiation, so on. Just remembering who got what and what the outcome was becomes a daunting task. So imagine, and it's a beautiful question because the simplest thing can provide the most immense value. If I were a physician, an oncologist, and a patient presents themselves to me, and we do the workup, we do the pathology, we do the diagnostic analysis, and I have a set of parameters. If I could go into the computer and into a table and just list the parameters, they would be essentially sort criteria. Like when you go into Excel and you choose you want to sort by this variable, that variable, and this variable, and hit sort. And what would come back would be essentially all the patients that look like me, rather the patient that is being, that presented themselves to me. And then I can say, oh, so here are all the patients, male, your age, stage 4 colon cancer, here are all the treatments that were done, here are all the outcomes. A simple sort, nothing else. And then I can say, so do we want to focus on quality of life, length of life, side effects? Because now I'm not even doing a regression or none of that stuff. It's simply a sort. How simple, right? Yet that's a challenge. That's a profound challenge that you have major institutions and a huge software analytics company trying to solve that challenge. How hard can that be, right? It's a brilliant question. You're absolutely right. And that's why I think we're still sort of struggling. And what was that process I just described, the sorting? That was a data reduction step. I reduced all the patients in my clinical repository down to the patients that look like the person who's standing in front of me right now. And the value, both from treatment and diagnosis, that simple sort can bring is profound. But it is fundamentally around bringing all those patients into one place so that sort can occur.
One question. Yes. So looking at the NICU simulation that you did, there was a lot of complexities around the nodes and decision points. As a clinician, having worked on quite a few of technical projects, it's very difficult to get the clinicians' processes and workflows and decision points and all of that into the minds and hands of the engineers working on developing these kinds of tools. What methodologies did you use, and how long did it take from the clinician's perspective?
So I didn't show you the reference, but this is a publicly available paper. This has been presented at multiple conferences. And you ask I think, a very profound question. We had the advantage of having physicians who were very, very savvy technologically, perhaps like yourself, who understood both the possibilities and the limits of software, but also lived that process, that workflow for years and understood it intimately. So in a sense, their challenge was, how do you convey that knowledge into these decision points and these nodes, to your point. And we also had the benefit of having a couple brilliant people in what's known as operations research or linear algebra, which is the fundamental analytic methods that underlie simulation and discrete event simulation. So I have found also in my experience that when you bring an expert technologist that may not even understand the domain together with an expert in the domain that may not understand what linear algebra is, that actually works. Because each does what they need to do, informed by the other, very efficiently. And so this was not a long and drawn-out process. Probably the data gathering was probably the longest thing. The actual building of the workflow at first replicated the workflow that the unit had. And I showed you that diagram, a very well-defined workflow. The objective fundamentally was to introduce into each of those boxes in the workflow mathematically derived decision points. And that was derived from historical data in the unit. Gestational age, treatments, how those treatments resulted in whether the child progressed to the next stage in the workflow in the unit, how that related to the discharge, to what kind of kids were coming in. So those were all very well documented historically. And then the physicians provided the technician the guidance of how to, yes, this is a probabilistic decision, or no, this is a discrete decision, right? This is a yes or no. Just say here, if this, then that, or no, actually, this decision depends on the dose of this drug. Build a model that says how that dose affects the mortality in this particular situation for this gestational age. Okay, you build that model. Now that model then becomes a decision point. So I've actually described exactly how it was done. And it was one individual doing the software and 2 or 3 physicians guiding their work. And they were using a graphical user interface exactly as I showed you. say this is a binary node, this is a probabilistic node, you double click it, and then you stick the math in there in the data, and it does some calculations. But to the earlier gentleman's point, the value is that it isn't a black box, that when a particular answer comes out, you can actually see at which point in that workflow and at what level affected either cost or length of stay, for example. And so iteratively then, you can refine the model. And it, by the way, I didn't mention this, but it becomes a learning model. So with each new patient, you basically rebuild everything. Because if it were static, or a new drug came into the picture, or the demographics of the hospital changed and a new type of problem arose, the model would, the simulation would fall apart. So the idea is that with each new batch of data, all those models, all those probabilities are recalculated, and it becomes a smart system.